Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Katie Smoller. I'm the Director of Educational Programs here at National History Academy. And welcome back as we virtually tour different sites throughout American history. And today we are fortunate enough to be joined by the Harriet Tubman National Historical Park. And we are with the Senior Interpretive Specialist, Kimberly Seswick. So Kimberly, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a very exciting time to be talking about Harriet Tubman as we get very close to our doors opening. The National Park Service has another site for Harriet Tubman down in Maryland. That's the Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park. And so we have a lot of Harriet Tubman information to pass on.
Great. And I did take away your screen sharing. So if you want to share your screen again, that'd be great.
Okay. I'm gonna pull up a little PowerPoint I put together. And we're just going to kind of have a quick overview of Harriet Tubman. So first and foremost, we do have her born and raised down in Dorchester County, Maryland, where that other national park is. And she is born enslaved, the fifth of 9 children. She herself is going to be leased out at the ripe old age of 5, sent to another farm where she's put to work in the swamps in the winter time. And that was to check muskrat traps. So of course, this 5-year-old, not clothed properly, just exposed to the elements, got very sick, and then sent home to her mother, who brought her back to health. She is then leased out again at 6 years old. And at that time, she is going to be leased to a woman who is notorious for her abuse of enslaved people. And here we have this 6-year-old who's going to be put to work caring for an infant. And the woman of the house, that notorious woman, met Harriet and said, with a whip in her hand, if that baby cries, this is what you're going to get. Well, of course, babies cry, that's their job. And Harriet was whipped, and it was said that you could still see the scars from that woman's whip above her collar for the rest of Harriet's life. We have her then working primarily outside. And one of the things, as this Harriet Tubman National Historical Park up here in Auburn, New York, is a new park, one of the things that I wanted to really delve into is exactly what kind of a world Harriet Tubman was born into. And of course, we have the signing of the Constitution. And at that time, no one could come to an agreement about slavery. So they just tabled the issue for about 20 years, thinking slavery is going to die its own death. The main crop that slaves were used on plantations for was tobacco. Tobacco depletes the soil, so a lot of farmers who turned to cyclical crops and timbering. So they really thought in 20 years, you know what, we're not even going to have to discuss it because farmers are going to manumit their slaves and just hire them back when they wanted them. But then we have the invention of the cotton gin not long after 1793, which changes the world. Prior to the cotton gin, if you wanted a new outfit, you better start planning about 1 year to 2 years in advance from start to finish. With the cotton gin, you could now card and create cloth very easily. So you can actually, instead of having somebody sit down with a bowl of cotton and carefully take the fibers off the seeds, you can grind them through a cotton gin and get that clean fiber, which is now going to be sent off to a factory. And so then to the store where you can get bolts of cloth. So one of the first things that's going to happen with the cotton gin is everybody's going to be rushing down south to scoop up as much land as possible so that they could start planting cotton. So Congress steps in and brings in the Mississippi Territory, and then that has the richest soil of the South. This is the Black Belt. And then they wanted more land. So in comes the Louisiana Purchase. That's the future states of Mississippi and Alabama. And then, of course, we have an act prohibiting the importations of slaves, which is going to be on January 1st, 1808. Now, Thomas Jefferson is in the White House at this time, and he is one of our first 12 presidents. 10 of them are enslavers. Jefferson has the most with over, he has over 600 slaves in his lifetime. Now that January 1st, 1808 is actually 20 years after Congress agrees to table slavery. And a lot of people thought, oh, wow, no more slaves being imported. This is great. Abolitionists are thrilled. They're saying, okay, we're moving forward to abolishing slavery. But actually what this did was shut down the transatlantic slave trade and ignite the domestic slave trade. And we have a lot of formerly and enslaved people on the northern part of the southern states who are going to be immediately sold down south to grow cotton. And we have, on top of all of this, the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution starts in England, comes over in New England, and this is where all those cotton bales are going to be sent to, especially in our New England section, where an integrated factory is going to be built, where the bale of cotton comes in on the first floor, goes through all the processes of carding and weaving and dyeing, and then comes out as a bolt of cloth. So all of these things are coming together very quickly. And this is Harriet Tubman's world she's born into. And one of the big things about that 1 million enslaved people being sold south that hits Harriet Tubman very directly is that 3 of her older sisters, Lena, Soph, and Mariah, are going to be sold south to cotton plantations and lost to the family forever. Now, Harriet was too young to remember when Mariah was sold, but she did remember when Lena and Soph were sold. And she remembered them crying and screaming as they're being taken. And she remembered the trauma that her parents went through losing those children. Now, of course, I also want to add in there that Congress will also pass in 1830 the Indian Removal Act, which is going to remove the Native Americans that are on their ancestral lands down south and move them out to the barren territories. That culminates in 1838 with the Trail of Tears. So Harriet Tubman, when we talk about her being leased out very young at 5, again at 6, she's already lost 3 sisters and witnessed 2 of them being sold. She, at the age of about 12 years old, is going to be sent on an errand to a store. And this is the store recreated down in Maryland. As she's walking in the store, an enslaved person's running out. And the overseer of that slave yelled at Harriet to stop that slave. But she didn't. She just stepped back and he ran out. And so the overseer picked up a 2-pound counterweight off the scale that was on the counter. And here's this full-grown man, short distance. He picks it up and hurls it as fast and hard as he can to try to stop his escaping slave, and misses him and hit Harriet in the head, crushing in her skull. What happened with this head injury will stay with Harriet Tubman the rest of her life. Almost immediately, she goes into a semi-coma, but she's only given a couple days to recuperate before she's sent back out into the fields to work. She said she could hardly see because of the sweat and the blood dripping down into her eyes. But we think today, looking at what she said her symptoms were, we think she started suffering from temporal lobe epilepsy. So she starts having violent headaches. In fact, these headaches get so bad that when she's in her 70s, she's in Boston, she sees Massachusetts General Hospital and goes over and talks to the doctors there, explained what happened to her back when she was 12. And they said, we think we can help you. Lay down on the table. So she laid down like a lamb to the slaughter, she said. They went to give her anesthesia. She refuses it and told them to proceed. And in her own words, she told them, proceed. And they cut her head open, sawed it open, she said, and lifted the bone, giving her some relief from the headaches. But that shows you how bad the headaches were, that she was willing at that time to submit to that type of surgery. So with the headaches, she will also have epileptic seizures. She will also have developed a type of narcolepsy. So she can be talking to you 1 minute and the next minute sound asleep. And she can sleep upwards of an hour. And then when she wakes up, she finished the sentence she went to sleep on. But when she's asleep, she has very vivid visions and dreams. This is very common with temporal lobe epilepsy. It's one of the hallmarks. But she is already a very religious woman. She also, we believe, some contact with her grandmother Modesty, who was born and raised in Africa. And so we think through her grandmother, she may have started at a very young age having some teachings of her own culture and religion. And then wherever she is working, she is required to go to church with whatever religion, whatever faith that family is practicing. So she had teachings from everything from Methodist to Catholicism. So it looks like she meshes this all together. And when she sleeps, those visions and dreams, she believes, is her God speaking directly to her. She will follow that voice the rest of her life. And many times it's prophetic, meaning that it told the future. And people would say, Harriet, how did you know these things? And she would say, very simple. She said, God told me. So she treated it very matter-of-factly and would even get angry when she was on a course previously directed. And then the voice went silent. And she would say, you put me here now. I need you. You need to tell me what you want me to do. So again, Harriet Tubman is going to have all of these symptoms the rest of her life. This is a newer picture discovered of Harriet Tubman about 3 years ago. We think it was taken about 1869 in Auburn, New York, and she is about 46 years old. We're not 100% sure of her birth date, but we believe this was taken after the Civil War, like I said, about 46 years old. So she would have looked like this when she married John Tubman, when she was about 23 years old. Now, at that time, her name was Araminta Ross. They nicknamed her Minty. And when she married John Tubman, a free Black man, she dropped Araminta and took her mother's name, Harriet, dropped her maiden name, Ross, and took her husband's name, Tubman. And since her husband was free, she wanted to make sure that she was free as well. So she went to her enslaver and said, look, let me lease myself out. When I get enough money together, I am going to buy my freedom from you. And through all this time I'm saving my money, I will give you $65 a year. So he agrees to this. And so Harriet starts working very hard, saving any money over what she has to pay her enslaver. And then 3 years down the road, her enslaver died. So of course, Harriet Tubman being enslaved, she cannot enter into a formal contract. This was just a verbal agreement with her enslaver. So with the death of her enslaver, there went the agreement. And then his widow finds out that her husband had left them deep in debt. And so so the wife told her children, don't worry, we're just going to sell property, meaning sell some of their enslaved people. And Harriet heard through the grapevine that it was her and 2 of her brothers who were going to be sold to pay that debt. So this is one of the horrible aspects of slavery, if not the most horrible aspect, is the separation from family. So Harriet and her 2 brothers had the choice to just stay with their family as long as they could and then be sold south. They never heard from the 3 sisters, never will. So they do know that that's pretty much a finite separation, or they could go north. Now, they don't have maps. They don't have contacts. They don't have money. They have nothing. They just know somewhere north there is freedom. Well, they chose freedom. And they left, but not long after leaving, one of the brothers who was married and left his wife in childbed, she just had a baby. He's like, I can't do this. I have to go back. And so the 3 return. And about 2 weeks later, that's when Harriet will leave on her own and make her way all the way from Dorchester County, Maryland to Philadelphia. Once in Philadelphia, she gets a job. She feels like this is total freedom. Of course, this is before the war, so she's still a fugitive enslaved person. But to her, Philadelphia felt like freedom. So she got a job, a place to live. she just couldn't believe how it felt. She said the sun was even brighter. But not long after being in Philadelphia, she started to miss family. So this is when she starts working with a man by the name of William Still, and we call him the father of the Underground Railroad. He himself had been born enslaved. His mother had tried to get herself and the 4 children out of enslavement, were caught and returned, and then the mother had to make a decision because she was still going to try to get free, how to do that. She couldn't do it with all 4 children. So she decided to leave the 2 oldest children behind, and she left with the 2 youngest ones. One of them was William Still. Now, William Still will grow up in freedom. It was successful in getting away. And William Still started to work for the Pennsylvania Vigilance Society, of which he will rise in the ranks in that organization. This organization is the one that is helping fugitive slaves get out of the South to North and even out of the country to freedom. So one of the things that William Still did was take meticulous records about the people that were coming through his office. And in one day, he's asking one of the freedom seekers, well, where did you come from? Do you know your enslaver's name? What were your parents' names? Do you know when you were born? All this kind of information he would write down. Well, he's interviewing this one man only to find out after questioning him, he is interviewing his brother. So William Still continues to interview people that are coming through his office to make sure that that information could be passed on down the road to reunite families. His records are still in print and you can still get them through Barnes and Noble. It's a very, very interesting individual. So William Still will be the one who's going to give Harriet Tubman the maps, the money, and the connections she needs to navigate the Underground Railroad over the next decade and bring up about 70 people during 13 trips down and back. And most of them are family and friends. She only returns to Dorchester County, Maryland, because that is the land and the area that she knows. She also only brings up people that she knows and can trust, because the first trip down that she's going to make from Philadelphia is 1850, which is also when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, making it illegal for anyone to help anyone who is considered a fugitive. It also allowed enslavers to send people or just vigilantes going out and trying to capture any what they called fugitive slaves. And it could be somebody who is free that is captured and then brought south and sold. So this was a very, very dangerous time for Harriet Tubman to be navigating the Underground Railroad. So 13 trips, about 70 people. One of my big questions was, like, how did she end up in Auburn? We have that Philadelphia connection. And then we figured out that William Still actually introduced Harriet Tubman to Lucretia Mott. Now, Lucretia Mott was a Quaker. She was very wealthy, an abolitionist and a suffragist in Philadelphia. And she actually opened her house as a station on the Underground Railroad. Lucretia Mott is the one who's going to politicize Harriet Tubman. In fact, Harriet Tubman by the mid-1850s is going to make her first speech against slavery. So Lucretia Mott's sister lives in Auburn, New York. That's Martha Coffin Wright. Now, Martha Coffin Wright also opened her home as a station on the Underground Railroad in Auburn. And Lucretia was up visiting Martha quite often. So we look at Martha Coffin Wright, and Martha Coffin Wright's husband's law partner is William Seward. William Seward, by the time Harriet Tubman met him, is going to be the senator from the state of New York and will soon run against Abraham Lincoln for the presidency, loses, and then becomes Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State during the Civil War. And he is also the one credited with bringing in Alaska, Seward's Folly. And it was his wife, Frances, who is the woman in the picture here, who's the true abolitionist in the family. She had witnessed slavery on one of her trips with her husbands and was just aghast with what she witnessed. So she became a staunch abolitionist. she also opened her house as a station on the Underground Railroad. And so these are the people that Harriet Tubman is going to start to meet and become very well acquainted with. And because of New York State's law that was passed in 1848, the Married Women's Property Act, Frances, who is the one in the family with the money, is going to inherit half of her father's estate. It's just her and her sister who are going to get all the money from their very wealthy father. And it's not just money, but lands and farms. And it's this woman, Frances Seward, who is going to sell Harriet Tubman a 7-acre farm on the edge of Auburn in Fleming, New York in 1859. Now, this is a classic example of everybody looking the other way because no one bothered Harriet Tubman or Frances Seward in the sale of this property. This would have been in direct violation of the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, and Frances should have been thrown in jail for up to 6 months, as well as fined over $1,000, which was a good $30,000 in today's funds. But no one, probably because of her husband's station at that time, no one looked at that transaction. So here in 1859, prior to the Civil War, Harriet Tubman will own a 7-acre farm with a farmhouse and barn on it. And this is how it looks today. This particular land is owned and operated by our legislative partner, the Harriet Tubman Home Incorporated. And this particular area is just an amazing area to visit, to walk on. You're on the land that Harriet Tubman lived in freedom for over 50 years. This is the land that she will farm. This house is the second house on the property. The first house, a wood frame house, burned to the ground in 1880. And by this time, Harriet Tubman has remarried to a man by the name of Nelson Davis. And so Nelson Davis, who was a veteran of the Civil War, was a brickmaster. And so after the house burned, Harriet Tubman and other relatives actually made the bricks and built this house that's there. So when anybody comes, we make sure that they touch that brick, because this is not just the land she was on, the house she lived in, but the very bricks that she put her hands on. This is how Harriet Tubman looked some years later. And she never stopped working for many of the things that she fought for. So we have her at the beginning of the Civil War getting this property, but she doesn't move there immediately. She had taken everyone that she had brought north up to Canada, got them settled there because the 18 Fugitive Slave Act, it was just too dangerous to be in the United States. But right as the war is starting, she goes to Canada, gets her parents and some other relatives and brings them down and gets them settled in the house. She gets promises from her wealthy friends, as well as many of the people that she's become acquainted with in the Black community that was well established in Auburn prior to Harriet Tubman's arrival. There's a good 300 souls in that community. And that's when, after she is convinced that her family is okay, she will leave to fight in the Civil War. Now, she just doesn't wake up one morning and say, okay, I'm going to go fight in the war. She is actually recruited by the governor of Massachusetts. He convinces Harriet Tubman that that knowledge she has gained on the Underground Railroad is going to be instrumental to the Northern Army, which it was. So off she went. She spent most of the war down in South Carolina. We know the common things based on her history books. She was a nurse, a spy, a scout, but she also had troops under her, Black troops, contraband, who had joined the army. When I say contraband, these are formerly enslaved people who are now gone and joined the Northern Army. And she takes them out into the wilds of South Carolina and acts as a spy, but also will report back any supplies that are there. And if the army cannot get those supplies for the Northern Army, then Harriet and her troops were known to just go out and destroy those supplies. She was also part of the Combahee River raid, helping to plan it and lead it with the white commanders of those ships. And she goes up and she helps emancipate 700 enslaved people. They get them on the boats and bring them out to the coast. During this whole Combahee River raid, one of the most instrumental things that Harriet Tubman did, that she had done reconnaissance with some of her soldiers to discover where in the river the Confederates had placed the mines. And so she was the one who was telling them where the soldiers could avoid those mines in the river. This is an even later picture. Over on the left, we have Harriet Tubman as a much older person. She's going to live to be about 91. A man who is sitting with the cigar in his mouth, that's her second husband, Nelson Davis. Now, John Tubman, he actually was the first person that Harriet, on her first trip south to emancipate people, knocked on John Tubman's door and said, "Come on with me north." And what she had done was save money in Philadelphia and bought a really fancy suit for him. Now, her plan was for John Tubman to put on that fancy suit. He is a free Black man, and she was going to pretend to be his enslaved person. And then they could actually travel out and up north, right out in the open. They didn't have to hide. But John Tubman said, "Well, Harriet, I didn't know if you were dead or alive. I remarried." Now, of course, Harriet could not enter into a formal contract, and that included marriage. So they weren't legally married. And so when John Tubman married Caroline, she was free. And so since both were free, they could both enter into a legal contract. And also Caroline was heavy with child. Now, Harriet was devastated, but she said she still offered to take them both north, but they decided to stay. They said they were fine since they both were free. Unfortunately, John Tubman, in approximately 1867 to 68, was in an altercation with a neighbor and was eventually, as this altercation escalated, murdered by the neighbor. So when Harriet found out about this up in Auburn, this is when she marries Nelson Davis. Now, Nelson Davis was formerly enslaved. Again, as I said, he was a veteran of the Civil War. And he's about 22 years younger than Harriet. He was renting a room in her house from her, which was a common way that Harriet would increase the money, the cash flow into the house. And he was dying from tuberculosis. So his story is quite a sad one, but we're not sure about this marriage as far as why they married. It could have been, of course, for love. It could have been where Nelson Davis said, "Look, I know I'm going to die. I am a veteran of the Civil War. I don't get much in a pension, $8 a month." But he said, "If you marry me, care for me, and then bury me when I'm gone, then you will receive my $8 a month pension." And that's exactly what happened. And he is also the one that became very adept at brick making, and he became a brick master. That was the industry for the Black community in the Auburn area. The two do adopt a little girl. Her name is Gertie, and she is right between Harriet and Nelson Davis. And she has a son who she names after Nelson, but the baby died at about 3 months old. And then Gertie headed to the Ohio Territory, so we don't know anymore about what happened to her. The other children in the photograph are her nieces and nephew. It was known that she cared for them when their parents became sick and passed away. She also opened her home in Auburn to take care of anyone that needed medical care, needed food, clothing. And so she had a cacophony of people coming in and out of her house. The woman far over on the right is blind Auntie Sarah Parker. So the fact they called her Auntie, at first people thought that she was a relative, and she was not. She was an elderly blind person that was unable to care for herself. And so Harriet Tubman took her in and cared for her and made sure that she was buried properly. Through all these years, Harriet Tubman is going to do a lot of fundraising. She supports Black schools in the South. She wants to make sure that Black children get the same education as white children do. She tries to get a school for Black girls open in Auburn. Unfortunately, she was unable to do that. She even had her biography written by a woman by the name of Sarah Bradford, who wasn't necessarily a historian. She was trying to embellish on Harriet Tubman's story so that the books would sell. And they did sell. And one of the people who read that book was Queen Victoria. And Queen Victoria was so impressed with Harriet Tubman's story that she sent her this shawl, which is now down at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. So Harriet's story through that book and other newspaper articles was known not just nationally, but internationally. Harriet in her older years also helped start an organization called the National Colored Women's Association, which is still alive and well today. And it seems about the time that Harriet had that head surgery that she really starts grappling with her own mortality. So some of the things we see her doing, such as helping to start this organization, is going to help continue what Harriet Tubman has been fighting for. And so the organization is started also because the white women's clubs, which were very popular at that time, would not allow anyone of color to join. So this group was started. Both groups were talking about what society needed and worked to solve these problems, such as schools and hospitals and nursing homes, which of course was Harriet Tubman's main focus as well. But they were also talking about the convict leasing system, the loophole in the 13th Amendment that allowed Jim Crow laws and Black codes to exist. They were also Harriet Tubman and this group were also fighting to make sure that Black people were allowed to vote. And you see this, all of this work that Harriet Tubman has been working her entire adult life is going to be funneled through this organization. She also will buy the 25 acres just next door to her property. And at this time, she will open this Harriet Tubman Home for Aged and Infirm Negroes. She sees this need within her community to take care of elderly people. And so she finds out very early on getting that property and trying to get this open that she just doesn't have enough money. She goes on the talk circuit. She asks her wealthy friends for money. She does fundraisers. She sells her produce. Everything she tries to do, it's only enough to really pay the insurance and the taxes. So this is when she turns the 25 acres with 2 buildings on it, this one and a wood frame one, and turns it over to the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church in exchange for they agreeing to actually get the Tubman Home for Aged and Infirm Negroes open. And they do that. It takes several years as they find out. It's a very difficult thing to do and very costly, but they do get it open. One of the things that they try right off is to start charging people $125 or $150 it goes up to go into this building. And Harriet is furious. She says, like, what part of indigent don't you understand? Of course, I'm putting words in their mouth. It's $150 was an awful lot of money. And she felt if they had that money, they would need to come into the home. But after about 3 years of arguing, Harriet relented and the church started charging for people to come into this, into the home. Harriet Tubman herself will live the last 2 of her years in this building because her body had failed her. Her mind was still there, but she needed help herself and became a patient in her own nursing home. Also about that same time where she's starting the National Association for Colored Women, she's getting the nursing home up and going. She also is a member of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. And so she will work with the congregation to build this church, which is in Auburn, which the National Park Service now owns that we're restoring. She will get this built because the church didn't have a good, solid, permanent building. And this will be a permanent building for her church's congregation for over 100 years. And that congregation is still alive and well today in a separate building. And they just renamed it a couple of years ago, the Harriet Tubman Memorial AME Zion Church. And she will attend this church for 22 years. And this is also the church where she was laid in state and was buried from. She was also a very staunch suffragist, and she was a very dear friend of Susan B. Anthony. And Harriet Tubman would go to some of the conventions with Susan B. And the last one that she attended with Susan B. Anthony, she came in on her arm, and the crowd just erupted with applause. So she was a very well-known person in the suffrage movement. Her stories of enslavement and what she went through really resonated with the women of that time period because they had very little rights as well. This is the last picture that we know of Harriet Tubman that was taken outside the home for the aged. I said she's about 91, 92 years old. During World War II, there was a ship that was named after her. Of course, there's been talk of having Harriet Tubman on the dollar bill, the $20 bill. So we still see her influence not only culturally, but we see it also in much of the work that goes on in this country to push for better nursing homes, education for all, and of course, voting. This is a picture inside the church when she is laying in state. The church is very original. There's most of the building is still as it was when Harriet Tubman was there. The women that you see surrounding her are the matrons. These are the women who worked at the home and cared for the patients. And this is her grave site, which is just a stone's throw from the church. And there is a beautiful tree planted by her niece and nephew. Harriet is buried next to her brother, and it was her brother's children that planted the tree, the Norway spruce, which shades her gravesite to this day. And these are just some of Harriet Tubman's relations that still live in Auburn. Most of the relations are descendants of Harriet Tubman's brothers. Now, Harriet Tubman, the fifth of 9 children, the 3 older sisters sold south. We don't know what happened to them. And Harriet Tubman's younger sister, Rachel, had died before Harriet could bring her north and was unable to get her 2 children out as well. We don't know what happened to them, but the 3 brothers were brought north, and these 3 women are descendants of those brothers. So I think we should probably stop at this point and see if we have any questions.
Oh, Kimberly, that was really great. Thank you for sharing all that with us. And we do have a bunch of questions, so we'll try to keep it somewhat in a good time frame. But we're going to be joined now by Ben Keller Halls. He's a former National History Academy student. He is our current intern at the program. And Ben himself is a future historian. He's a junior at the University of Arizona. So Ben, thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, of course. This is awesome. Maybe our best site yet, if I dare say. But so yeah, we have some questions about how the site operates and about Harriet Tubman's life and all over. So let's start with maybe from a big picture about being at a site like this. With the political legacy of Harriet Tubman's life in so many ways, as you mentioned, and nursing homes and education and so on. And also now with the way that history is so political and talking about these figures is very divisive, or can be. How do you work with that in its current state at this site?
I think what's so important when we're talking about history is to look holistically at Harriet Tubman's life, or anybody's life. We have to look at the entire thing. And so that's why looking at the world that Harriet Tubman was born into, and how did she navigate that? And then for us as individuals, hearing her story, if we see any correlations, how are we going to manage this? How can we have our voice heard And by using people in our past and learning from them, I think is the biggest asset to history. When I first started reading about Harriet Tubman, most of the stories treated her as if she lived in a bubble. Like the outside world was not impacting her at all, that she was autonomous and got up every morning and said what she wanted, what she was going to do. But she was under all these laws. She had eyes on her constantly. She wasn't even a person. She's owned. She's chattel. She's no more a person than the cow in the field. So we need to be able to look at the laws that were enforced at that time that were going to capture her, to keep her, what's set up by our country to keep her enslaved, and then how she breaks out of that, and then also how she navigates herself and the system to be able to bring people north to freedom. So it's not necessarily telling the story and then saying, oh, this is what's happening today. We really need to concentrate on what's happening then and see what her legacy is. How was she able to navigate this? And I think that really informs where we've come from and understands maybe better where we are today when we look at why do I feel a certain way, or why is this being shown to me in the movies, something like that. And we look back at history and we can see, some of the things that have changed our minds or why we might feel a certain way. So history is very important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of great sense. So on that note, in her lifetime, you can see how on the one hand, she was not going to have the prominence maybe that of Frederick Douglass or William Lloyd Garrison. We talk about the abolition movement and it's full of men, right? And these newspapers that were run by men, propagated by men. And yet on the other hand, you have situations like Sojourner Truths, where a Black woman is not really considered a woman by the early suffragette movement. So how does someone like Harriet Tubman manage to play those two sides at the same time?
Her story, she actually was a very incredible speaker, and she captivated audiences. She was a very good storyteller. She loved to tell her stories. And the way she told them engaged many of the white women in the suffrage movement. And these women at that time saw a correlation between their lives and Harriet Tubman. So, for example, an enslaved person, say a enslaved woman, when she had a child, that child was owned by her owner. If Harriet Tubman, enslaved, had a child by John Tubman, free man, that child, according to the law, followed the legal status of the mother. So it depended on, for enslaved people, it went to the owner, the enslaver of that woman. White women would look at that, and if they had a child, they did not have the rights of that child. Their husband did. So say the husband didn't want that child, the husband was free to give that child away without regard to the wishes of the mother. So it's things like this that resonated with her audience, and they saw a correlation, and they heard her story of how she broke that law, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, and self-emancipated and was successful in reaching freedom. So her oratory skills, her stories, and that ability to make that connection with people really pushed her forward. So, and that really has kept her alive over the years as well, as so many of her stories have been carried through for children's books, and of course, recently in very serious historical research on her life. We keep finding more and more information.
Yeah, and when it comes to that notion of remembering a figure like Harriet Tubman, in your view, how much does something like the $20 bill change matter, really? Is that something that seems like too little too late, or it's great because it's a representation of her,
I look at money, this is just my personal opinion, as pocket history. So every time I look at on who's on a bill, and even if I'm in a different country, I look and see now who's on that bill. Why did they put that person there? So I think it's very much any kind of thing, postage stamps the same way. They kind of bring us back to our roots and say, now, why do we have this person on this stamp or this money? And what did they do? I think it's just an invitation to learn more about our past.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We know that there is another national park site concerned with Harriet Tubman. Well, how does your guys' curriculum match or compare to theirs?
We work very closely with Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad National Historical Park. They really concentrate on her early years, and we really concentrate on her free years. And we kind of look both at the Civil War because she's in both areas. And we also work closely with other national parks like Reconstruction era National Historical Site and other sites that had something to do with Harriet Tubman or slavery. And that way we broaden our story, because those historians at those parks may come and have us think a little different about the history of Harriet Tubman by bringing forth something that we might not have looked at, or looked at it differently than we would. Because of course, history is always changing. It just depends on viewpoints, new evidence, discussion, and questions. You know, would this have happened? Maybe we should look at this person who now we know was in her life. It's always this evolution of research and questioning that brings us forward. And because wherever the historian is interpreting somebody, we're influenced, whether we know or not, by the books that we've read, by what we were taught in school, what's in our movies, what are the books that we're reading. So history will change as our culture changes as well. So that's why history is always going to change and move forward and expand.
Yeah. So we had a question about, well, first let's get to maybe this one is that we have one that's sort of an extension of that question. What do you hope people take away from this site when they come and visit?
I get this so many times, this question. And I have to say that I think every week I come away with something different, and I'm there all the time. So it's very much, I think, learning about Harriet Tubman, her fortitude, what her challenges were. I had no idea that she had temporal lobe epilepsy. I never knew she had these blinding headaches or sleeping illness. I'm imagining her as a very strong and powerful woman, which she was, but so much so she was fighting through all these other physical problems. So I get headaches. Well, I get a headache and I'm going to go to my room. I'm going to take an aspirin and I'm going to turn the lights out. Well, Harriet Tubman, no, she's just driving through and continuing on and putting her own feelings, even physical feelings, to the side and pushing through. So I look at that. I look at how during the Civil War, she understood about cleanliness, and she talks about how she was constantly washing the soldiers to keep them clean, keep the flies off of them. And she also had a good understanding of herbal medicine, which she had been taught by her parents and grandmother, and was able to use that to take some of the suffering away. So I come away with thinking about that, how she used that resource. So I'm always just coming away with different things. It's a very personal takeaway when you come in and you visit her place in freedom, which we don't hear much about. So the majority of her life is in freedom. And what did she do with that freedom? And to stand there and to know by touching the brick of her house that this is where she lived for so many years. It's just amazing.
Yeah, it really is. One of my personal takeaways from your presentation today was you can see also the centrality of family, of resilience, of personal sacrifice, and of religion, and in the ways that that sort of melds together. I find those things to be central in American, African American history all the time.
Yes.
And with that, I wonder what do you think of this notion of generational trauma? Because with these themes and with the immense suffering and things that these people went through, there's more and more scientific research happening now to maybe there's a lot to be said for generational trauma and how that not only societally these things still matter, but like literally for people, these things still matter.
We have just started to really look into that, to read what is new on the horizon for that. It's a new idea and a new concept. I know one of the things that we delved deep into this past summer, because I did have some interns on site, we were really looking at Nelson Davis, Harriet Tubman's second husband. Now we've heard that one was saying he was a brute, and another was that he wasn't worthy to be Harriet Tubman's husband. So when we're talking about trauma, we said, well, we don't know the trauma of Nelson Davis. He was born enslaved. That in itself is a trauma. How he was treated, we don't know. We do know during the Civil War, the battles that he was in were some of the most horrific. And because they are Black troops, many times they are sent in first. So some of the war that he saw, the engagements that he was in, were some of the worst. So we know he's taken away extreme trauma from that. And then he's out and he finds out he has tuberculosis. And of course, the nickname at that time was consumption, because it consumes you slowly or consumes you quickly. You don't know. So he's living with this knowledge that he could die at any time. So if he's not kind and sweet, we have to look at him differently than just one word brute. We need to look at him as a person that went through multiple traumas. But he still helped start a church in Auburn, of which lasted about 10 years. But he was one of the people who started and ran it. We believe he was part of the Black Masonic group there. We do know that his daughter Ida adopted Gertie with Harriet Tubman. Gertie named her son after him. So there had to have been some sort of kindly relationship there, or love. So we have to look at the whole spectrum, and with new ideas. This is an extension of history with like generational trauma. I want to learn more about that and see from the experts more about that. But I like, and I think of Nelson Davis right off and saying, okay, if he if we knew more about Gertie, or Gertie's, did she live? Did she have other children? Is that family still have those family stories? Could we discover more? Could we see if that traveled? We don't know, but yeah, it was a very interesting summer sitting and talking about trauma. And that was like the beginning of that. We started talking about that, learning about generational trauma, just hearing about the concept. So.
Yeah, and it runs at the beginning of your presentation today. You mentioned what was called at the time slave breakers being sent down further south to a more rough, more brutal enslaver. And that's something that like Frederick Douglass went through, so many people went through, and who knows what kind of impacts that could have.